Roosevelt led a charmed life. State Senator, Assistant Secretary of the Navy, candidate for Vice President, and all that before the age of 39. He was handsome, energetic, eager to achieve still greater things. Then, on August 10, 1921, while vacationing at his family's summer home on Campobello Island, Roosevelt fell ill. For the next 7 years, Eleanor and Louis Howe, FDR's closest advisor, did their best to keep the Roosevelt name alive, while Franklin struggled to undo the terrible damage that had been done to him. In 1928, Al Smith was the Democratic presidential frontrunner, and FDR agreed to nominate him once again at the convention. For this appearance, Roosevelt concentrated on mastering what was called a two-point walk. Gripping a cane in one hand and holding on to the arm of a companion, he swung one rigidly braced leg forward from the hip and then the other, while smiling and nodding as if he hadn't a care in the world. He could only manage a few steps, but he seemed to be walking, and that was what mattered. After the convention, Smith asked FDR to run for governor of New York. To prove to skeptics he was up to the job, FDR campaigned in all 62 New York counties, something no candidate for governor had ever done before. On election night, Al Smith lost his chance at the presidency, but Roosevelt narrowly won the governorship. After 7 years of struggle, he was back. Franklin Roosevelt never overcame polio, but he did not allow it to overcome him. It withered his legs, but as Americans were about to learn, it also strengthened his character, and it had not crushed his spirit.
So this house was built sometime by the 1820s. We don't know the exact date, but the deeds, the records that Franklin found suggest that this structure was built sometime at least by the 1820s, and that his dad bought it in 1867. And so it was about 17 rooms at that time. Franklin's dad bought a smaller house, still a pretty substantially sized house. But if you want to see what that house looked like, there are 2 kiosks over there by the fire hydrant down that way. One of them is what the house looked like before it was renovated. So you can see that 17-room farmhouse style structure. And compare it to this house, which was renovated in 1915, because Franklin had a growing family as well as growing political ambitions by that time. So they raised the central roof in 1915 to add a 3rd floor for the Roosevelt children's bedrooms, and also added fieldstone wings at either side of the house. Servants' quarters and largely servant spaces downstairs for about 10 employees in the house, and a family library and living room and bedrooms up on this in this wing on the 2nd floor, which you'll be seeing today. And Franklin was Assistant Secretary of the Navy in 1915 when they made those changes to the House, and had higher political ambitions for himself, of course. His fifth cousin Theodore had been, of course, in the White House and inspired Franklin in his political career. Franklin really did follow in his footsteps in a lot of ways. Of course, will be Assistant Secretary of the Navy in the same way that TR was, runs for Vice President, although loses that one, and of course is Governor of New York and President of the United States. And so he told his law partners, Franklin, shortly after he began practicing law, that this was his intention. They said, well, what are we going to do with our lives? What are we going to be when we grow up? You know, that sort of conversation. And Franklin said, well, I'm going to be president of the United States. And reportedly no one in that room laughed, because they knew that he had a pretty good chance at it, knowing that TR, of course, was already there. And so this is a place where Franklin comes throughout the rest of his life to launch political campaigns, right here from this front porch. Also comes back here on election night. 3 out of the 4 times that FDR won the United States presidency, he spent election night in his family's dining room. And the other photo over there on the kiosk is of election night 1940, taken right here under this portico. And you can see in the photo Franklin and his wife and his mother, and a lot of folks that were from the area in front of the house. So they would come out on election night for a torchlight parade. The neighbors would come and they would sing songs, they would talk to the press, and then Franklin would come out once the election results were in, out to the front porch, as he is in the photo, and thank everybody for coming, and always ask them to show their appreciation for him next time by voting for him. Because he lost Dutchess County in his hometown of Hyde Park in every presidential election that he ever ran in, which is kind of a way for us to understand that he was a very popular president. He was made president of the United States 4 times, and there were quite a lot of people who liked him and agreed with him, but then there were other people that disagreed with his policies and his ideas during his New Deal. Some of the wealthy businessmen that lived along the river here that disagreed with those policies and felt that he was a traitor to his class. And they called him that man in the White House instead of President Roosevelt while he was living in the White House. So it's a way for us to understand Franklin's role here in this community. If you go to the Presidential Library and Museum, right in the basement, you'll see that Ford Phaeton that he had fitted for hand control, so he could drive that car after polio with his hands. And he drove that car around this area and met with his neighbors, farmers on the sides of the road. And many of those people helped him understand the need for programs, social programs, like Social Security, banking regulations like the FDIC to avoid another Great Depression. And Franklin was never hungry or jobless or homeless himself, but obviously many of the people that he knew in his community were, and he was concerned about what they needed. And so that's another way for us to understand who he was and why he did what he did. And I think this is one of the reasons why he decided to leave this home and property to us, so that we can come here to talk about these things that happened during his lifetime and his presidency. We're going to go in the house, so please, as we do, keep in mind those rules that we talked about before. Keep in mind that the objects in the house are in most cases original. I'm going to have you look around the first floor, see these rooms here, and once you've had a chance to look around, we'll gather by the front door, talk about Franklin's life here in the house. I'll answer your questions, and then we'll go upstairs to the second floor, where you'll get a chance to see bedrooms and other family rooms on the second floor, and that's where we'll finish the tour. As you go inside, think about the fact that this house opened on April 12th, 1946, 1 year to the day after Franklin died down in Warm Springs, Georgia. President Truman was here to give a speech that day. Marian Anderson performed the national anthem on the front porch, and Eleanor Roosevelt was here to give some of the first tours. So I'm going to talk to you folks today and tell you a little bit about the family's life here in the house and tell you some of the stories that Mrs. Roosevelt shared with us. I'm going to stand in for Mrs. Roosevelt today, so there's some pretty big shoes to fill. Literally, she was 5'11", but also, of course, she was a very important person in this story as well. So. But the Roosevelts did not have electricity here until 1908. That would have just been the town's electricity that they hooked into at that time. So they did have modern amenities here, though, as far as central heating and plumbing, which was installed in the 1870s by James Roosevelt. So they would have had those amenities in the house when Franklin was growing up. And Franklin, of course, comes from a wealthy family. I was mentioning that his ancestors made money in the sugar trade. So if you saw the portrait of Isaac Roosevelt on the left side of the library, he was involved in the sugar industry, the sugar trade, and also in banking, helped to start the Bank of New York with Alexander Hamilton after the American Revolution. So a wealthy family, although not the kind of wealth when we talk about the Vanderbilts or the gentlemen who were making money in new industries in the 19th century. When we think about Cornelius Vanderbilt and railroads, when we think about the other fortunes that were being made in oil and steel and in banking in the 19th century. The Roosevelts are what we would think of as an old money family because they had made their money early on in this nation's history. And so Franklin and his parents kind of looked down their noses at people like the Vanderbilts down the road from here. But Franklin was different, in that way. By the time he comes along, he has different ideas about society and about the classes in this country. And Franklin was really dedicated, as we all know, to the idea of helping people in this country help themselves. When we think about the work that he did during his presidency, during the Great Depression and the New Deal. And I think people often have come here and wondered how a man who grew up in this wealth and privilege understood the perspectives of people that needed those job programs during the Great Depression, who needed Social Security, who needed the Tennessee Valley Authority to put electricity in rural homes. And this is something that is, there's a lot of answers to that question over the course of his lifetime. Franklin was inspired by his father in the idea of noblesse oblige, or noble obligation. He was, of course, inspired by Eleanor, his wife, to do good, to help people, because Eleanor, early on in her life, lost her parents. She was orphaned, and she went to boarding school in England and learned at Allenswood Academy from Marie Soubest at Allenswood Academy about the idea of social justice and about using your positions of privilege and wealth to help other people. So Franklin, throughout his life, is really dedicated to these ideas. So this house is a way for us to understand Franklin's life. Born upstairs on the second floor on January 30th, 1882. You're going to see the bed in the bedroom where he was born. Raised here in this house, and then comes here to live after he marries Eleanor in 1905. They also had a townhouse on 65th Street in Manhattan that Sarah, his mother, built for Franklin and Eleanor shortly after their marriage. So they would have at a number of places where they lived. Also a summer home up in Canada across from Lubec, Maine. And of course, Franklin, during his political life, would live in many different places, bringing his family with him to live in Albany when he became a state senator in 1910. And then, of course, Assistant Secretary of the Navy, living in Washington during the First World War, becoming governor of New York, living again in Albany, and then again in Washington as president. So his family moved around a lot, but they always considered this home. The Roosevelt children, as I mentioned, 5 of them, always considered this kind of their home base. And Sarah, Franklin's mother, was part of that story until September of 1941 when she died. So you're seeing a lot of Sarah here in the house. She's the one who in many cases chose the decor, the furnishings, the Italian credenza, the Dresden china in the music room. But the collections on the walls are things that tell us more about Franklin. So as you look around and see the birds behind the glass case that he hunted here on the property, those are things that he was interested in as a young man, but also tells us something about him as a politician, as president. Because when he was a little boy, his father gave him a pellet gun and told him that he could only hunt 1 male and 1 female of every bird species, their nesting or migrating pairs. And so learning about conservation at a young age, and as president, he signed a Migratory Bird Protection Act. He created more than 40 wildlife refuges in this country during the time of his presidency. So he's learning about these ideas as a young man, and this will carry throughout his life. The naval prints on the walls are part of a large collection of naval history objects that Franklin had. If you've been over to the Presidential Library, you'll see some of his model ships in the basement. And he was very interested in naval history, wanted to be a naval officer. He pictured himself when he was a little boy climbing the trees on the property, imagining himself on the tall masts of sailing ships. But he will go on to be Assistant Secretary of the Navy during the First World War, which he always called his favorite job. And these objects were on the wall when people came to visit. When people like Winston Churchill came here during the Second World War, he would have seen these naval prints on the walls. When King George VI and Queen Elizabeth come here in 1939, they saw these political cartoons on the wall. And Eleanor as I said, gave some of the first tours here. So she told a story about these political cartoons. Eleanor said that when King George was coming, Franklin's mother, Sarah, asked Franklin to take these cartoons off the wall, because some of them are kind of poking fun at England for losing the colonies during the Revolution, that sort of thing. So Sarah thought that the king was going to be offended by these and that he would come and leave basically after seeing them. But shortly after arriving, the king kind of made a beeline for them. It was the first thing that he was interested in seeing, according to Eleanor. And he stood there in silence, studying all of them, looking at all the pictures. And then finally he told Franklin that he was furious because the king said that Franklin had some in his collection that he didn't have in his own collection back home in England. So this is a way for us to understand, I think, the family dynamic in this house. Sarah decorates, Sarah's in charge, and yet she loved her son, her only child, and was very proud of his interests in his collections and let him keep these on the wall despite her misgivings. And I also like to think about Eleanor Roosevelt telling that story here in 1946, standing in the same spot where we are today. So we're lucky in that the Roosevelt family left these objects here for us to learn about FDR in the same way that people did when he was living, the same way that people did when he was president. Because he brought people here, not just to the White House. He wanted people to come here to Hyde Park to meet with him because he felt that this was a place where they could get work done in a more efficient way, in this less formal place where they could come to get to know each other first. We're going to go upstairs to the second floor, and I'm going to tell you about some things you're going to see so you can be set free in a more self-guided way. And you're going to be up there looking around, but I will be up there to answer questions if you have any. Right at the top of the stairs is the trunk lift, so you can take a look at that as you get to the top of the stairs and see how Franklin got up there. Behind the metal gate at the top of the stairs are where the servants had their bedrooms. There were about 8 to 12 servants who lived in the house that would have helped Franklin and his family take care of the house, like a housekeeper, butler, maid, cook, laundress. And then there was another ramp on those stairs that Franklin used after polio that he used to get up to the second floor. Guest bedrooms on this side of the second floor and family rooms on this side. And there's a mirror on the wall at the end of the hall that is at a 45-degree angle that the Secret Service used to monitor that family hallway so that they didn't necessarily have to go into the family spaces. They could see the whole hallway from there using this mirror. But please go past that mirror and see the family rooms used by Franklin Eleanor and his mother. And then when it's time to go, your exit will be on the second floor through those 2 French doors. You're not going to see the river behind the house because he planted more than 500,000 trees during his lifetime, Franklin. And of course, many of them have grown up in the meantime as well. But it is about a half mile away from the house. Before you leave today, make sure you take a look down that hill behind the house and picture Franklin sledding down the hill as a little boy. Because he said when he couldn't sleep at night, he didn't count sheep in bed at night at the White House. He pictured himself back home at Springwood, sledding down that hill and walking slowly back up it again, because he loved being here so much. It was really his happy place. And he said, all that is within me cries out to go back to my home on the Hudson River. This is where he hoped to retire and write detective novels and his memoirs. So unfortunately, he didn't get a chance to do that. But thank you for coming out here today to the home of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, our nation's 32nd president. And on behalf of the National Park Service and myself, I want to thank you for your visit and wish you safe travels when it's time for you to leave us later on today. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. Let's go upstairs.